Hey guys, tonight we are slipping back into a time so ancient that it makes even the pyramids look like new construction. Picture this. The air is hot and dry, the stars stretch endlessly across a black sky, unpolluted by modern light, and somewhere in a mud brick courtyard, a little girl tilts her head upward and wonders who might be listening from those glowing dots above. You've probably never met her, but she's about to become one of the most important voices in human history. And here's the kicker: you probably won't survive this bedtime story. Not because it's scary, but because you'll be asleep long before the end. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from some far-off corner of the world, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing the little map we're secretly building together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The stars over the city of yore twinkled with the kind of brightness that modern eyes rarely see. No neon signs, no street lamps, just the Milky Way sprawling like a river of crushed diamonds across the sky. Somewhere on the roof of a palace in Akkad, or later in the sacred city of yore, a girl named Enheduanna would have grown up staring at these same stars. To her, they weren't just pinpricks of light. They were God's eyes, ancient watchers, each dot of light carrying meaning, stories, and perhaps instructions for the mortals far below. The city of yore itself was already impressive by her time. One of those bustling Sumerian city-states with canals running like veins through the mud-brick sprawl. Picture broad avenues lined with merchants calling out about their grain, beer, and woven cloth. And somewhere, always, the scent of roasted barley or date wine floating through the air. In the center stood the towering ziggurat, a massive staircase temple dedicated to the moon god Nanna, whose light waxed and waned over the desert, guiding both farmers and priests. Even for someone born into royalty, like Enheduanna, the sight of that massive temple rising into the star-drenched sky must have seemed otherworldly. What made the stars so crucial in this world was not just their beauty, but their order. The Sumerians were some of the earliest stargazers, charting constellations, using them for agriculture, and believing them tied directly to divine will. If the moon skipped a beat in its cycles, people panicked. Was Nanna angry? Did some ritual go wrong? Enheduanna, growing up, would have understood that those glowing dots in the sky were both a calendar and a divine message board. There's something strangely calming about imagining those ancient nights, the city settling into silence, goats bleating in pens, reeds rustling along the canal, and up above the galaxy unrolling its blanket. This was the same night sky that inspired her first thoughts of poetry, though at this stage she was just a girl listening to priests chant to scribes, carve cuneiform into damp clay, and to her father's advisors whisper strategies for ruling half of Mesopotamia. Now, let's pause on that thought. One mainstream historical fact here. The Akkadian Empire, founded by her father Sargon the Great, was the first known empire in recorded history, stretching across much of Mesopotamia around 2300 BCE. That alone would have shaped her worldview. Imagine being the daughter of the man who invented empire as a political form. But here's a quirky tidbit historians love. In those days, the moon was indeed seen as a glowing orbit, was believed to be made of a shiny, divine substance. Some texts even suggest people thought the moon could physically pour blessings onto earth like liquid silver. Whether or not Enheduanna believed that as a child, it's not hard to picture her lying awake, imagining moonlight dripping down into her hands. Of course, historians still argue whether she actually spent her earliest years in Akkad, or if she was sent to Ir almost immediately as a symbolic gesture of her father's power. The records are fragmentary, and like so much of ancient history, we're left peering into cracks of clay tablets and guessing at the missing lines. Still, wherever she spent her first years, one thing is certain. Her life was steeped in ritual. Picture the steady rhythm of Mesopotamian time. The market bell ringing at dawn, scribes sitting cross-legged with classes, scratching against wet clay, women grinding grain with long, sighing strokes of heavy stones, and priests lifting their arms in prayer, while smoke curled toward the stars. That was the music of her childhood, the lullabies of the world's first great cities. The girl herself. We don't know if she was mischievous, shy, or bold, but we can make an educated guess that she was observant. How could she not be? Later her words would drip with imagery so vivid that it's hard not to imagine. Her as a child with wide eyes, noticing the way torchlight flickered on temple walls, or how the scent of frankincense hung heavy during ceremonies. If you close your own eyes for a moment, you can almost be there. The clay dust between your toes, the faint scratch of reed mats beneath you, the hum of insects in the warm night. Maybe you're listening to someone chant a hymn to Inanna, goddess of love and war, while the shadows of priests and priestesses sway like tall reeds. It's a place where the divine was never distant. The gods weren't abstractions. They lived in the stars, in the moon, in the thick air after a storm. Enheduanna grew up in this environment where every object, from a bronze cup to a stray cat, had spiritual meaning. That worldview shaped her imagination and later her poetry. She wasn't just writing for entertainment. She was crafting words that might actually bridge the gap between mortals and gods. Imagine carrying that pressure from childhood. Every star you see might be a god listening. Every prayer you hear might be judged for correctness. That's the atmosphere in which she first gazed upward and began her journey into words. Now, if we shift back to the city itself, Ur was more than temples. It was life buzzing along canals. Boats glided with red sails. Fishermen pulled up their catches, and somewhere a brewer prepared vats of beer thick enough to eat with a spoon. Children played in alleys, tossing knucklebones or chasing each other around piles of clay bricks drying in the sun. These ordinary details made up the world that Enheduanna absorbed the balance of sacred and mundane. Later, her hymns would weave both cosmic battles and small human longings. as though she knew that gods and people lived side by side. And perhaps that's why she resonates so strongly even now. Because under those stars, before she was priestess or poet, she was just a child watching the endless night. Maybe asking the same question you've asked at some point. What's out there, and who's listening? The stars didn't answer her directly, of course. They never do. But they gave her the stage, and eventually they gave us the world's first named author. Enheduanna's story doesn't truly make sense until you realize whose daughter she was. Her father, Sargon of Akkad, wasn't he just some local ruler? He was the man who stitched together the first real empire in human history. Imagine waking up one morning and finding that your dad had taken over the entire known world. That's the kind of shadow she grew up in. Sargon's story was the stuff of campfire tales. Born a nobody, raised as a cupbearer, then suddenly catapulting himself into kingship through sheer ambition and probably a fair share of luck. He marched his armies across Sumer, defeating city after city, and before long the Akkadian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And here's the mainstream historical fact for youth. This was around 2330 BCE, give or take a few decades, when the concept of empire was practically brand new. Before Sargon, rulers were content to dominate a single city, and maybe slap around their neighbors. Sargon thought bigger. For Enheduanna, that meant her childhood was soaked in politics. Every conversation in the palace halls echoed with questions of loyalty, trade routes, and looming rebellions. She would have watched men and women in elaborate headdresses and robes bow before her father, promising tribute, while envoys slipped bribes under the table or whispered treachery in the corners. Being Sargon's daughter, wasn't he? Just about having a privileged seat at the table was about understanding that the table itself could flip over at any moment. And then there was her mother. Here's where things get fuzzy. We don't actually know who Enheduanna's mother was. Some texts suggest she was a Sumerian noblewoman, chosen strategically to merge Akkadian and Sumerian bloodlines. Others suggest her identity has been lost entirely. Historians still argue whether that silence was intentional, as if wiping her name preserved Sargon's myth as a self-made man, rather than the product of alliances. For Enheduanna, that meant a piece of her origin story would always be clouded, a missing line in a clay tablet. What we do know is that Sargon placed enormous importance on cementing his rule not only through force, but through culture and religion. And here's where his daughter became the keystone. Appointing her as High Priestess wasn't just an honor, it was political chess. By installing his own bloodline into the temple of Yor, he tied the divine power of the moon god Nana directly to his dynasty. It was genius, really. Make your child the voice of the gods, and suddenly rebellion against the king becomes rebellion against heaven itself. Still, you can imagine the personal side of this arrangement. What was it like for Enheduanna to be raised not just as a royal child, but as a symbol of cosmic order? Every meal, every lesson, every prayer wasn't just for her. It was for the empire. Even the way she breathed probably felt like it carried weight. Let's not forget royal children in Mesopotamia didn't exactly live in a carefree bubble. They had tutors drilling them in cuneiform, priests teaching them hymns, and possibly even lessons in mathematics and astronomy, since temple officials were also the scientists of the day. Somewhere young Enheduanna was learning how to press a reed stylus into wet clay, turning sounds into symbols. Those little wedge marks would later carry her own voice into eternity. Here's a quirky tidbit. Mesopotamian kids, even royal ones, sometimes played with toys made of clay-tiny carts, miniature animals, and even rattles. Imagine Enheduanna as a child, shaking a clay rattle shaped like a pig, while her tutors reminded her she'd one day be the earthly voice of the gods. That kind of contrast must have been jarring. Childhood innocence mixed with divine destiny at like asking a 5-year-old to both play tag and also prepare for a career as the Pope, and yet the role stuck. As she grew older, she must have internalized her father's vision, that she wasn't just Enheduanna, little girl looking at the stars, but Enheduanna, chosen thread weaving her family into the fabric of heaven. There's also a deeper layer here. By making her high priestess of your Sargon, wasn't just merging family and religion, he was merging two cultures. Akkadian was his own Semitic language, while Sumerian was the tongue of the conquered cities. Enheduanna, born of this union, became a living bridge. She likely spoke both languages fluently, a rare skill at the time. Through her, Akkadian and Sumerian beliefs blended, making her not just a religious figure, but also a cultural translator. Historians still debate whether this was a smooth blending or a tense balancing act. Some think she was genuinely revered, a symbol of unity. Others suspect she was resented, a foreign implant in our sacred traditions. After all, nobody likes when an empire installs its own people in local temples. Imagine a stranger waltzing in and suddenly claiming to be the ultimate authority in your neighborhood church. Wouldn't tea go over well? That tension is important, because it meant that while Enheduanna was royal, powerful, and sacred, she was also vulnerable. The temple she would one day rule was both her stage and her battlefield. But before all of that, she was still the daughter of a man who cast a long shadow. Picture her at a royal feast, watching Sargon lean back with a goblet of date wine, laughing with generals, while scribes read out reports of new conquests. To everyone else, Sargon was king, almost godlike in his power. To her, he was simply father, and like many daughters of powerful men, she must have felt a mixture of awe, pride, and maybe even frustration. It's here that we glimpse the seed of her later writing. Her poems carry both reverence and raw human emotion, sorrow, joy, doubt. It's tempting to imagine those feelings first took shape in her youth, listening to her father's booming presence, realizing she'd never simply be herself. She would always be the daughter of Sargon, carrying the impossible task of living up to both empire and eternity. And so the stage was set. A girl born into empire, raised in shadows of ziggurats and politics, destined not just to serve the gods, but to give them a voice. Whether she wanted the role or not, history had already chosen her. The day came when Enheduanna's life took a permanent turn. She left behind the palace air of Akkad, with its clamor of generals and bureaucrats, and began her journey southward to Ur. Imagine the caravan, ox-drawn carts creaking under the weight of gifts and supplies, soldiers marching with spears flashing in the sun, and attendants bustling around her, as if every step needed ritual approval. This was no casual move. It was the transfer of a royal daughter into a sacred role that would anchor her father's empire. The route from Akkad to Ur was long, dusty, and filled with contrasts. The land shifted from river-fed plains dotted with date palms to stretches of cracked mud where the Tigris and Euphrates receded. Along the way, she would have passed other cities, Nippur, with its massive temple to Enlil, and perhaps Lagash, with its bustling workshops and carved boundary steles. Each stop reminded her of the complexity of her father's empire. Different gods, different customs, but all forced under one banner. She must have sensed the tension already simmering in these places, a reminder that her journey was not just personal, but profoundly political. Now, let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. Ur was one of the most significant cities of ancient Sumer, particularly during the early dynastic and Akkadian periods. Its ziggurat to Nana, the moon god, was a centerpiece of both religion and culture, towering over the city like a staircase to the heavens. That temple complex wasn't just a place of worship, it was an economic powerhouse, managing grain, livestock, and labor. Being sent there as High Priestess meant Enheduanna wasn't just walking into a religious role. She was stepping into the heart of power. But what did Ur feel like to someone arriving for the first time? Let's paint the scene. The city's outer walls rose high and thick, plastered with mud and brick, a sign that here was a place worth defending. At the gates, merchants jostled with donkeys loaded with sacks of barley and jars of oil. Children darted barefoot through alleys, their laughter rising over the cores of fishmongers. And above it all, the great ziggurat loomed. Sunlight glared off its plastered sides, the staircases steep and daunting, climbing tear upon tear toward the sky. For Enheduanna, that sight must have been overwhelming. In Akkad, she was a princess. In Ur, she was about to become something more and, perhaps less, more, because she would serve as the earthly representative of Nana, the moon god. Less, because her personal identity would dissolve into her title, En, the High Priestess. From that moment, she wouldn't just be Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon. She would be Enheduanna, vessel of divine will. The temple life itself would have struck her with its rhythm. Priests in long woolen robes moved like shadows across courtyards. Musicians plucked lyres with silver strings, filling chambers with haunting melodies. Incense curled from burners, sharp and resinous, sticking in the throat. Every doorway bore inscriptions, every object a reminder that the gods were watching. Even the floor tiles, pressed with repeating patterns, suggested order and divine symmetry. And then there was the ziggurat at night. Under the moonlight, its staircases glowed pale, casting long shadows across the silent city. Torches flickered at its base, but the summit seemed to touch the stars. To Enheduanna, newly arrived and perhaps still unsure of herself, it must have looked like the spine of the world, a place where heaven and earth pressed close enough for words to pass between. Here, S, a quirky tidbit about you might not expect. Archaeologists found evidence of what seemed to be board games, including the famous royal game of yore, with dice-like objects and decorated boards. Imagine Enheduanna, in between lessons on ritual chants, sitting cross-legged with attendants, sliding game pieces around, while trying not to laugh too loudly in the temple's solemn corridors. Even priestesses needed moments of ordinary play. Of course, her arrival wasn't met with universal joy. Historians still argue whether the citizens of Yore welcomed her as a divine bridge, or resented her as a political imposition. To the loyalists, she was a living bond between king and god. To the skeptics, she was a foreigner installed to control their temple. Enheduanna would have felt the weight of those eyes in reverence, some suspicious, every time she walked through the sacred courtyards. But here's the subtle brilliance of her position. By physically relocating to Yore, she embodied the union of two worlds. Her Akkadian bloodline tied her to her father's empire, while her role in the Sumerian temple tied her to the spiritual heart of Yore. Through her, cultures met. Through her, politics wrapped itself in the glow of the divine. And maybe during those first nights in Yore, when the temple was finally quiet, she stole away to some high terrace and looked again at the stars. Only now, they weren't distant or abstract. They were her colleagues, her audience, perhaps even her critics. She was no longer a child wondering if the gods listened. She was the one expected to speak to them, clearly and convincingly, on behalf of an entire city. It must have been terrifying, and yet there's something calming about picturing her standing there. Hair lifted by the desert breeze, torchlight dancing across stone, rehearsing in her mind the words she would soon deliver in sacred rituals. Words that had to be perfect, not just for the gods, but for the fragile balance of an empire. The title N was more than a badge of office. It was transformation. Once she was enthroned as the high priestess of Nana in your Enheduanna's life, shifted into a rhythm so precise it almost felt mechanical, yet it pulsed with spiritual intensity. From this point on, her name was less personal and more cosmic. She wasn't simply a daughter of Sargon anymore. She was the human voice of the moon god. The ceremony itself must have been elaborate. Picture the ziggurat at dawn, the first pale streaks of sunlight sliding down its massive sides, while priests in white wool gathered at its summit. Incense smoke coiled upwards as chants in Sumerian reverberated against the walls, low and steady, like the hum of bees. Enheduanna, clad in ceremonial robes, probably layered linen, bright with color and fastened with beads of lapis lazuli at the center. A diadem may have crowned her head, glittering with gold and semi-precious stones. The priests and priestesses would have lifted their hands, reciting prayers that bound her to her role forever, a living link between the mortal world and the divine. As High Priestess, her responsibilities were staggering. Every day she had to oversee offerings, libations of beer, bread baked from temple-owned grain, slaughtered sheep laid before the altar. She ensured that rituals followed strict calendars tied to the moon's waxing and waning. Imagine her standing in the temple courtyard at night, the crescent moon shining above, directing chants to match the phases of Nana. A single mistake in timing a prayer recited too early. An offering missed could be interpreted as cosmic insult. The survival of the city's crops, its prosperity, its peace, all seemed to hang on her shoulders. And yet, the role wasn't purely religious. The temple was also the city's economic hub. She would have presided over scribes tallying up barley stores on clay tablets, accountants tracking temple lands, and foremen reporting on laborers dredging canals. In many ways, she wasn't just a spiritual leader. She was CEO of one of the largest organizations in the ancient world. For the people of your divine favor flowed through her, but so did jobs, food, and stability. Now, here's a mainstream historical fact. In Mesopotamia, temples controlled vast amounts of land and resources, often rivaling kings in wealth. The position of En wasn't just about prayer. It was raw political power wrapped in ritual language. By placing Enheduanna in your Sargon, essentially fused monarchy and priesthood into one family enterprise. Still, amid the grandeur, the everyday details mattered too. Priests blew conch-shell horns to summon dawn rituals. Musicians played harps with silver inlays. Sacred statues were bathed, dressed, and perfumed daily, treated like living beings. Enheduanna oversaw it all, ensuring the gods were not only worshipped but cared for in the most literal sense. But how did she feel in this role? That's the question we keep circling. Historians still argue whether her position was mostly ceremonial, or if she wielded genuine influence. Her own writings, though, suggest the latter. She spoke with authority, not as a puppet of her father, but as someone who believed herself genuinely chosen by the gods. And here, where the quirky detail sneaks in. Some rituals required priests to interpret omens from sheep livers, Bai's liver divination. Imagine Enheduanna presiding over ceremonies where a poor animal was sacrificed, its liver examined for strange marks, and the results presented as cosmic prophecy. It sounds odd to modern ears, but to her audience, this was serious business. A blemish in the wrong spot could mean drought, invasion, or the gods' anger. Of course, none of this happened in a vacuum. Political tension simmered all around. The citizens of yore had their own loyalties, their own priestly families, who may not have been thrilled about Sargon's daughter running their temple. Whispers must have drifted through the courtyards. She's Akkadian, not Sumerian. She serves her father more than our god. Those doubts would follow her for years, and they weren't entirely wrong. Her role was always double-edged, sacred authority for the temple, but also political anchor for an empire. And yet, within that tightrope walk, she began to find her voice. Standing before the altar, chanting invocations to Nana, she was no longer simply repeating traditional hymns. She started to weave her own words into the fabric of ritual. She shifted from echoing the past to shaping the present. This is where the poet began to emerge. There's something powerful about imagining her at night, walking alone across the temple roof, moonlight painting her robes silver as she whispered lines to herself. Not yet formal hymns, but fragments, simiches, rhythms, thoughts. She was rehearsing, not just for the gods, but for herself, exploring the boundaries of her own voice. That voice would soon change literature forever, but for now it was still soft, tentative, testing its echo against the stone walls of the ziggurat. What must it have felt like to carry that dual weight of family, empire, and heaven itself, while still being, at the core, a human being? She must have felt awe, fear, pride, and fatigue all mingled together. Maybe she longed sometimes for the simpler days of playing the royal game of yore as a child. Maybe she smiled secretly when temple musicians hit a sour note. Maybe she even rolled her eyes at bureaucrats bickering over barley. Because behind the title, she was still Enheduanna, a woman of flesh and breath, learning how to wear divinity like a robe heavy, dazzling, and never quite her own. Every morning Inyo began with a rhythm as predictable as the sunrise. The temple gates creaked open, incense was lit, and offerings prepared long before the city's markets stirred. Enheduanna's life as En was shaped by these cycles. To be High Priestess was to live on a timetable not of her own choosing, but of divine expectation. At dawn, she would lead or oversee the presentation of food and drink to the gods. Imagine the scene. Long tables laid with steaming loaves of barley bread, bowls of fresh dates, jugs of beer that foamed at the lip, and cuts of lamb still steaming from the morning's sacrifice. Priests would chant as they placed each item before the statues of Nana and Ningal, his consort. The gods, of course, did not physically eat, but the ritual smoke rising from burnt offerings was believed to nourish them. People believed that without these daily meals, the gods might grow displeased, and displeasure meant disaster-failed harvests, floods, invasions. Enheduanna, standing before the altar, was responsible for making sure nothing went wrong. A misstep in the ritual could be interpreted as cosmic insult. Even the way she raised her hands had to be precise, fingers angled in the traditional posture of prayer. Imagine that pressure. Not just don't mess up in front of people, but don't mess up or the moon god might doom the city. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Mesopotamian temples functioned as more than spiritual centers. They were economic engines. Records from your show temple staff managing herds of sheep and goats, overseeing fishing fleets, and controlling agricultural lands. Enheduanna's responsibilities included supervising these resources. She was entaged, chanting hymsi, was signing off on accounts of how much barley had been delivered and how many sheep were fit for sacrifice. But daily rites weren't only about logistics. They were also about performance. Every gesture carried symbolism. Oil lamps flickered in dark chambers, casting statues in shifting light so they seemed alive. Musicians plucked lyres, their chords resonating against clay walls. Incantations filled the air in a language both poetic and mysterious. Enheduanna's voice, calm yet commanding, would rise above the others, intoning words believed to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. And, of course, there were special ceremonies. Once a month, when the new moon rose, the temple came alive with heightened intensity. Enheduanna herself likely led prayers in the moonlit courtyard, her robes glowing pale in the silvery light. Crowds of worshippers gathered outside the sacred precinct, pressing their faces to the gates, listening for her words. In those moments, she wasn't just a priestess. She was the voice of Nana himself, speaking reassurance that the divine order remained intact. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some ritual prescriptions included using cosmetics as part of temple service. There are references to priests and priestesses applying scented oils, eyeliner, and pigments, before major rites not for vanity, but to honor the gods with beauty. You can picture Enheduanna, carefully lined eyes catching the firelight, a touch of perfumed oil on her skin, not to impress mortals, but to reflect divine radiance. In a way, her very body became part of the ritual. Of course, the weight of all this was exhausting. Behind closed doors, after the incense cleared and the worshippers dispersed, Enheduanna must have felt the fatigue sink into her bones. The prayers were unending. The demands of the temple bureaucracy never ceased, and always the knowledge lingered that she was being watched not only by mortals but by gods. Historians still argue whether her role was one of true independence or constant surveillance. Some suggest she wielded her own authority, trusted by priests and kings alike. Others suspect she was tightly controlled, her every action reported back to Sargon's court. Whatever the case, she carried herself with dignity, enough that later generations copied her hymns and preserved her name on clay tablets, rare honor for anyone, especially a woman. But even as she navigated this balance, she began to leave her own imprint. When she spoke the words of ritual, she didn't just recite tradition. She wove in her own images, her own voice. Slowly, the rituals of Nana and Inanna bore not only the weight of the gods, but the fingerprints of Enheduanna's creativity. Imagine her at the close of a long day, stepping out onto the temple's roof terrace. The city below hummed faintly dogs, barking, a child crying, a merchant's voice drifting through the night. Above her, the moon floated clear and round, serene as ever. She would breathe deeply, the scent of incense still clinging to her robes, and perhaps whisper a line not meant for anyone else. A private prayer, half poem, half sigh, words that were hers alone, before she offered them to the gods. That was her life, public ritual by day, private searching by night. A woman both burdened and blessed, walking a narrow line where a single slip could mean chaos. Yet a single word, spoken with power, might hold the universe steady. The voice of the goddess was not a thunderclap from the heavens. It was not lightning striking a ziggurat. It was a woman's voice, measured, steady, and burning with something beyond ordinary speech. That woman was Enheduanna. By now, her daily responsibilities in the temple were routine. But routine does not mean dull. It meant precision, rhythm, and repetition until those chants sank into her marrow. Yet what set her apart was that she began not only to repeat what others had taught her, but to compose words of her own. That shift from rote priestess to poet priestesses, what makes her unforgettable. Picture her seated in a quiet chamber of the temple, oil lamps flickering along plastered walls, reed, stylus in hand. A clay tablet rests before her, its surface still damp. She leans over, pressing neat little wedge shapes into the clay. At first, she may have copied traditional prayers to Inanna and Nanna, but slowly the lines shifted. She inserted herself into them. Her pronouns changed. The I appeared. She dared to speak as herself in relation to the gods. A startling innovation in a world where most hymns were anonymous or spoken impersonally on behalf of the community. Here, S, a mainstream historical fact. Enheduanna is credited with some of the earliest surviving examples of first-person poetic expression. Her compositions to Inanna, like the exaltation of Inanna Ninmisera, are among the first works in which an author speaks directly, confessing fears, sorrows, and hopes. She didn't hide behind anonymity. She signed her work with her own name. That act alone made her history's first known named author. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of years of oral traditions and hymns had existed before her. Countless voices had spoken to gods and people alike. But theirs were voices lost in the crowd, like stars in a vast sky. Enheduanna's voice, on the other hand, carved itself into clay. She stepped forward from the chorus and said, "This is me. These are my words." The poems themselves were more than pretty verses. They were instruments of power. Take her hymns to Inanna. They describe the goddess as fierce, radiant, terrifying in her storms, yet also a source of protection and justice. By elevating Inanna, Enheduanna also elevated herself, because she, as high priestess, was Inanna's earthly mouthpiece. To honor the goddess was to affirm her own authority, but her writing also revealed vulnerability. Some lines of the exaltation describe her personal despair during exile, pleading for divine intervention. This blending of public ritual with private pain was revolutionary. Instead of the distant, stoic tone of most temple hymns, her words carried heat, trembling, and intimacy. She wasn't just the goddess's voice, she was her own. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Clay tablets weren't always neat little squares. Some were round or pillow-shaped, designed to fit comfortably in the hand. Scribes sometimes nicknamed them exercise tablets when used for practice. You can imagine Enheduanna drafting her words on smaller practice tablets, smoothing and reshaping clay as she wrestled with the right phrases, before inscribing them on the larger official versions, destined for temple archives. It's a very human image, high priestess pausing midline, sighing and muttering "no, that's not right," before reworking her own hymn. And the debates. Oh, there are many. Historians still argue whether all the poems attributed to her were actually her work, or if later scribes credited her out of reverence. Some think her voice shines through unmistakably, with a style so distinct it couldn't be mere imitation. Others suggest the possibility of a priestly school writing under her name, turning her into a brand rather than an individual. Yet, even if she didn't compose every line, the fact remains. Her name endured, her authorship claimed, and her persona shaped the tradition. Her compositions also had political weight. By praising Inanna as the goddess who bestowed kingship, Enheduanna's words reinforced the legitimacy of her father's dynasty. Each hymn was both spiritual devotion and political propaganda. Cleverly, she tied heaven's will to Akkud's rule. In other words, her poetry wasn't just art, it was strategy. And imagine how these words were performed. Not silently read in private, but sung or chanted aloud in temple courtyards. Her lines echoed against mud brick walls, carried by the voices of choirs, accompanied by drums and lyres. Worshippers gathered outside the sacred precincts, catching fragments on the breeze. Through those sounds, Enheduanna's own emotions spread across the city, woven into divine ceremony. But what about her inner world? Behind the public performance, there must have been nights when she sat alone, stylus set aside, staring at the moon through a narrow temple window. Perhaps, she whispered drafts under her breath, pacing slowly, robes brushing against the stone floor. Maybe she felt pride at her words, or fear that they weren't enough, or hope that Inanna herself would hear and answer. That tension between duty and doubt, between ritual and raw humanity is what makes her voice timeless. One line survives that still resonates. She writes of being driven from her role, stripped of her place, crying out to Inanna for help, and then her triumphant return. It's raw, almost painfully personal. She lets us glimpse her suffering and her resilience. That is not the voice of a faceless priest reciting rote lines. That is a woman bleeding into her clay tablets, daring to turn her own story into prayer. And if you're listening closely, you can almost hear her voice now. It is calm yet fierce, soft yet sharp, a lullaby and a war cry at once. The voice of a goddess filtered through the soul of a woman who refused to stay silent. Power is intoxicating, but it rarely comes without risk. For Enheduanna, the crown of the high priestess was both a halo and a target. In time, that tension snapped. A rebellion rose against Akkadian authority, and suddenly the woman who had been the calm voice of divine order found herself stripped of her role, exiled from the sacred temple she had once commanded. Imagine the shock of it. One day she was clothed in white linen, standing before altars as the city's lifeline to the moon god. The next, she was cast out, her authority erased with the sweep of a rival's hand. The temple gates that once swung open for her now closed, the chants she had led now performed by others. The statues she had perfumed and adorned now tended without her touch. The records are hazy, but her own words survive. In her poem Ninmesara, the exaltation of Enheduanna describes the anguish of exile. She writes of being forced to wander, of having her holy crown stripped away, of pleading with Enheduanna to restore her dignity. It is one of the earliest literary accounts of personal suffering, and yet she channels that despair into poetry so potent that it becomes both lament and weapon. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Around this time, rebellions did erupt against Sargon's empire. The city-states of Sumer were never content under Akkadian rule. Leaders like Lugalain, a usurper in Yor, tried to break free from imperial control. Enheduanna, being both a priestess and the daughter of Sargon, was a convenient casualty in the struggle. Remove her, and Yor symbolically severed its ties to Akkad's dynasty. But exile is never just political, it's deeply human. Picture her wandering outside Yor, the desert wind stinging her face, sand crunching underfoot, no incense, no lyres, no sacred statues, just silence, broken by the cry of night birds. She who had once commanded the gods' attention was now reduced to pleading for their mercy. And yet, in that darkness, her voice sharpened, her words grew raw. She poured her grief into clay tablets, transforming loss into literature. She wrote of her shame, of humiliation, of begging for restoration. This was no distant priestly chant, it was confession, heartbreak, and stubborn faith braided together. In fact, some scholars call this the world's first recorded literary autobiography, because she speaks so directly about her own experiences. Here, as a quirky tidbit, Mesopotamian scribes were trained to copy and preserve texts in temple schools, and Enheduanna's lament became part of their curriculum. Imagine a young student, centuries after her death, dutifully pressing wedge signs into clay, not realizing he was copying the personal anguish of a woman who had once lived through political disgrace. Her exile became homework. Historians still argue whether her exile lasted months or years, or whether she physically left Yor at all. Some believe she was pushed aside in ritual, but remained nearby. Others insist she was driven into the wilderness, her role violently usurped. The details blur, but her own poetry makes the emotional truth undeniable. She felt cast out, dishonored, and desperately in need of divine vindication. And vindication came. According to her writings, she called upon Inanna, the fierce goddess of love and war, to intercede. She praised Inanna's storms, her lightning, her power to overturn kings and restore justice. These weren't empty words. They were both prayer and political strategy. By aligning herself so completely with Inanna, Enheduanna claimed divine justification for her return. Can you picture her reciting those lines aloud in exile? Her voice echoing across a barren courtyard, hands lifted to the sky, moonlight painting her face. She would have been exhausted, perhaps angry, perhaps trembling, yet her words burned with determination. Those chants were more than ritual. They were survival, and eventually they worked. The rebellion faltered. Akkadian control returned, and Enheduanna was restored to her role as High Priestess. In her own telling, it was the goddess Inanna who lifted her from despair and placed the crown back on her head. Whether you see it as divine intervention or political maneuvering, the fact remains. She reclaimed her place. This moment of exile and return marks a turning point. It transformed her from a ceremonial figure into a living symbol of resilience. She was no longer just the daughter of Sargon, no longer only a caretaker of rituals. She became the embodiment of endurance, a woman who could be cast down yet rise again, her voice stronger than before. When you read her words today, you can still feel that heat. It's not just history, it's personal. She's whispering across 4,000 years. I suffered, I fought, and I spoke, and my words carried me home. Her return to Yor was not simply a reinstatement. It was a transformation. The Enheduanna who walked back through the temple gates was not the same woman who had once been crowned High Priestess in silk and ceremony. She was harder, wiser, and sharpened by exile. She had suffered disgrace, tasted the bitterness of being cast aside, and emerged with a voice that now carried both vulnerability and unshakable conviction. When she was restored to her role, the city must have felt the shift immediately. Picture the temple precinct buzzing against scribes, hurrying with clay tablets, musicians tuning lyres, priests preparing offerings. The crowds gathered as they always had, but this time, when Enheduanna stepped forward, her presence was more than ritual. It was proof of resilience, of cosmic approval. To many, her restoration confirmed that the gods themselves had spoken, favoring her above her rivals. The rituals resumed. Bread, beer, lamb, incense, the daily cycle ticked on. But now, her words carried a sharper edge. When she lifted her arms to the moon, it wasn't only Nana who was addressed. Inanna, fierce and unpredictable, was invoked with renewed force. Enheduanna had made the goddess of storms her champion during exile, and she continued to exalt her. Each hymn doubled as devotion and as testimony. I was cast down, and Inanna raised me back up. Here, a mainstream historical fact. Enheduanna, hymns to Inanna are among the earliest texts to portray a goddess as both tender and terrifying, capable of granting favor but also unleashing violent retribution. This dual image mirrored Enheduanna's own experience, soft priestess in robes, yet storm survivor in spirit and politically. Her restored role was a masterstroke for Akkadian power. By triumphing over rebellion and resuming her priesthood, she embodied the permanence of imperial control. Her very survival said, "You can try to resist, but the gods themselves will bring me back." That message would have rippled through every city that considered rebellion. But let's not forget the human side. Imagine her re-entering the chambers she once called her own. The walls the same, the statues unchanged, the scent of incense familiar, yet everything felt different. Every step she took reminded her of what she had lost and fought to regain. Perhaps she touched the altar and paused, whispering thanks not just to Inanna, but to her own endurance. Perhaps she remembered the cold nights of exile and felt an almost guilty relief to stand once more in the temple's glow. Quirky tidbit time. Clay tablets weren't only archival. Some were buried in temple foundations as offerings, inscribed with dedications for protection. Scholars wonder whether some of Enheduanna's compositions might have been placed this way, literally cemented into the city's sacred bones. If true, then her words didn't just echo in rituals, they physically held up the temple walls beneath her feet. Historians still argue whether her restoration meant she wielded more power than before, or if it simply reinstated her as a ceremonial figurehead. Some argue she emerged as a kind of political oracle, her hymns treated as binding decrees. Others suggest her authority was symbolic, her real value being the propaganda of her survival. Either way, her writings don't sound like those of someone silenced. They sound like someone who had found her full strength. One of her restored roles was the composition of temple hymns across different cities. These weren't just artistic exercises, they were administrative tools, standardizing worship across the empire. Imagine her stylus scratching words into clay, lines praising temples from Eridu to Nippur, weaving them into one coherent fabric of devotion. Through these hymns, she unified the spiritual map of Mesopotamia under Akkadian oversight. Her pen, in other words, was a political instrument as sharp as her father's sword. And yet, amid all this, the image of her alone at night lingers. Perhaps after a long day of ceremonies, she climbed again to the roof terrace of the ziggurat. The desert wind tugged at her robes. The moonlight painted the steps in silver. She breathed steady and calm, and for a moment it was just her and the stars. Not the priestess, not the politician, not the voice of empire. Just Enheduanna, the woman who had been broken and had learned to write herself whole again. Her return to power was more than a political restoration. It was proof that words could outlast disgrace, that poetry could rebuild a throne no army could protect. From here on, she was no longer just part of the machinery of ritual. She was a symbol of survival, of faith, of the strange, stubborn strength of the human voice. If exile had forged her resilience, her restoration opened the gates for her true masterpiece, the crafting of hymns that would echo far beyond her lifetime. Enheduanna turned her pain and her triumph into words, and those words became the foundation of something astonishing, the world's first literary canon. Imagine her chambers in the temple, clay tablets stacked neatly on reed shelves, scribes seated cross-legged, waiting for dictation. Enheduanna would sit at the center, stylus in hand, or dictating in deliberate, melodic tones. Her words were not random prayers, they were carefully constructed poems, designed to be copied, sung, and spread from city to city. These weren't meant for a single ritual. They were meant to unify an empire under a shared spiritual language. Here, the mainstream historical fact. Her Temple Hymns, collection of 42 compositions, were written to honor the major temples across Sumer and Akkad. They are often cited as one of the earliest systematic attempts at creating a literary corpus. Through these hymns, she tied local gods and shrines to the overarching divine order, knitting diverse regions together under a single religious framework that was nothing less than political genius disguised as devotion. But it wasn't dry propaganda. The hymns are filled with vivid imagery. She wrote of temples gleaming like mountains, of gods striding through storm clouds, of sanctuaries humming with life. Each temple wasn't just a building, it was a living personality, with moods, tempers, and divine charisma. When she spoke of them, she made bricks breathe. And, crucially, she didn't erase herself from these hymns. She stamped her authorship on them. Some tablets close with the line, "The compiler was Enheduanna." Think about how radical that was. For thousands of years, stories and prayers had been anonymous, handed down like a faceless chain. Enheduanna broke the mold and said, "I wrote this." She became visible where others had been invisible. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. In Mesopotamian schools, scribes in training would copy texts over and over as practice. The temple hymns were preserved this way for centuries, passed down like math problems or grammar drills. That means young scribes, long after Enheduanna's death, were sweating over clay tablets, copying her words line by line, perhaps cursing under their breath when they smeared the clay. Unknowingly, they were keeping her voice alive. Historians still argue whether she personally composed every hymn, or if she oversaw a team of scribes who helped craft them. Some point to stylistic differences and suggest collaboration. Others insist her distinctive voice can be traced throughout, even in the more formulaic pieces. But whether or not she wrote every line by hand, the vision was hers. The structure, the themes, the daring insertion of her own identity that's unmistakably Enheduanna. Picture one of these hymns being performed. The temple courtyard filled with smoke from incense burners, musicians plucking lyres, singers chanting her lines in unison. The words rise into the night, blending with the scent of roasted offerings, echoing against the ziggurat walls. Ordinary worshippers stand outside the gates, listening as her poetry becomes prayer, and prayer becomes power. It's not just religious ceremony, it's performance art, theater, and politics all at once. And it worked. Through these hymns, cities far apart were bound together in shared reverence. Farmers in Nipper, herdsmen near Eridu, merchants in Akkad, they all heard the same words, shaped by the same author. In a sense, she created the Mesopotamian version of a national anthem, only multiplied 42 times over. But let's not romanticize it too much. Writing hymns was grueling work. Clay tablets weren't elegant scrolls. They were heavy, breakable, and required endless patience. Imagine her stylus slipping, ruining a line, forcing her to smooth the clay and start again. The lamps smoked, the night dragged on, and her hands cramped, and yet she persisted because she knew the stakes. The canon she produced became her armor against time. Through those hymns, she ensured she wouldn't be forgotten. She wasn't only the high priestess of Nonnosh, she was the poet who gave temples a voice. Her empire might crumble, her father's dynasty might fade, but her words were pressed into clay, baked and buried in archives where they waited to be rediscovered. It's almost eerie to think about. 4,000 years later, archaeologists brushing sand from fragments of clay tablets in Iraq found her name still intact. Enheduanna. She had been waiting all along. So, when you imagine her at her writing desk or perhaps dictating to a circle of scribes, know that she wasn't just writing for her generation. She was writing for every generation that came after. She was building a library not of bricks and mortar, but of memory and voice. And in that moment, seated under the glow of oil lamps, the high priestess became something more enduring than a priestess. She became literature itself. Titles like High Priestess and Daughter of Sargon can make Enheduanna feel impossibly distant, like a figure carved from stone rather than a living, breathing woman. But peel back the ceremonial robes, set aside the chants and the politics, and what emerges is someone startlingly human. The question is, who was she when she wasn't speaking for gods or empire? Start with the daily silences, the hours after ceremonies ended. Imagine her chambers, mud brick walls plastered smooth, oil lamps casting soft halos of light, reed mats lining the floor. Her diadem rests on a shelf, her ceremonial robes folded away. She sits quietly, the din of temple life fading outside, and for the first time all day she is not the high priestess. She is simply Enheduanna. Perhaps she hums to herself. Perhaps she runs her fingers over the rim of a clay cup, lost in thought. In these private moments, doubt must have crept in. Did she ever wonder if the gods truly listened, or if her father had thrust her into this role more for politics than destiny? Her poems reveal flashes of this inner struggle. When she wrote of exile, she didn't pretend to be unshakable. She cried out, vulnerable and wounded. That is not the voice of someone immune to fear. It is the voice of someone who wrestled with it and chose to speak anyway. Here is a mainstream historical fact. Some surviving hymns attributed to her include not only praise but also lamentations, a striking mixture for religious texts. Instead of a constant tone of glory, she allowed space for sorrow, even anger, blending emotions rarely acknowledged in formal prayer. That tonal range suggests she was willing to blur the line between public ritual and personal confession. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Cosmetics were a regular part of elite Mesopotamian life, including among priestesses. Archaeologists have found small stone jars that once held scented oils, pigments, and powdered minerals used for eyeliner and blush. So, picture Enheduanna preparing for a ceremony, carefully applying dark kohl around her eyes, brushing perfumed oil into her hair not as vanity, but as part of embodying her role. Still, behind closed doors, maybe she smiled at her reflection, thinking she looked fierce enough to rival Inanna herself. Historians still argue whether she had much freedom outside ritual obligations. Did she share laughter with handmaidens? Did she ever sit with musicians after formal performances, listening casually as they plucked melodies on lyres? Did she walk in temple gardens, letting her fingers brush the tops of reeds as dragonflies buzzed around her? Or was she cloistered, bound by her title, her human impulses squeezed into the narrow corridors of duty. The records don't say, but the mere fact that she wrote with such emotional richness suggests she lived deeply, noticed closely, and loved fiercely, if only through words. Imagine her humor. Yes, humor. The same woman who poured her anguish into clay must have also known how to laugh. Maybe at the clumsiness of a novice priest dropping a tray of offerings. Maybe at the exaggerated seriousness of a scribe who got ink smudged across his face. Maybe at herself when her stylus snapped mid-line and she muttered something less than holy under her breath. And then there's the loneliness. Even surrounded by attendants, she must have felt a gulf between herself and others. To be in was to be set apart, elevated above ordinary women, yet constrained by expectations no one else bore. When she cried out in her hymns, "I have been cast aside," it wasn't only politically, it was personal. She was admitting how isolating power could be. Still, she found ways to humanize herself through writing. She did not erase her fear of failure or her longing for restoration. She etched them into clay, as if to say, if the gods don't hear me, maybe the future will. And here we are, thousands of years later, listening. Think of her seated at night, a tablet on her lap, stylus poised. The city outside is quiet, save for the distant splash of water in canals and the occasional bark of a dog. She hesitates, then carves a line not just for the gods, not just for the empire, but for herself. A private thought transformed into immortal words. She sighs, smooths the clay surface when a phrase doesn't fit, and tries again. And in that small, intimate act, she reveals more humanity than any grand title could convey. That is Enheduanna behind the veil, devoted yet doubtful, powerful yet lonely, regal yet playful. A woman whose strength came not from being flawless, but from daring to write her flaws into eternity. Storms of empire were never far away, while Enheduanna shaped hymns and rituals inside Ea's sacred precincts. Outside her temple walls, the Akkadian Empire churned with unrest. Sargon's conquest had stretched across Mesopotamia like a stitched quilt, binding together city-states that never stopped tugging at their seams. Wars flared, alliances cracked, and whispers of rebellion traveled faster than caravans along dusty roads. Enheduanna lived at the intersection of heaven and politics. Every time she stood before the altar, she wasn't only chanting for Nana or Inanna, she was reinforcing her father's empire. Her role wasn't optional. Her hymns were propaganda draped in sacred robes. Yet those political storms had a way of slipping into her own life. The rebellion that once sent her into exile wasn't a singular event. It was part of a wider cycle of resistance that gnawed at Akkadian rule. Here's a mainstream historical fact. After Sargon's reign, his sons Rumosh and Manishtushu struggled to keep the empire intact, facing repeated uprisings from Sumerian cities. The Akkadian dynasty was powerful, but it was never secure. Enheduanna's career unfolded against this backdrop of instability, where temples doubled as political fortresses and priests as intermediaries between restless cities and imperial rulers. Inside the temple, the The storm felt distant at times. Daily rites continued. Incense curled upward. Hymns reverberated across courtyards. But the echoes of rebellion still found their way in. Messengers from the palace carried news of battles lost and won, of uprisings crushed or swelling again. Every victory reinforced her importance, proof that Akkad and Yor still stood together. Every defeat cast doubt on her authority. If the empire faltered, would her voice falter too? And yet she wove storms into her poetry. In her hymns to Inanna, she describes the goddess as tempestuous, raging like a thunderstorm, scattering armies as easily as the desert wind scatters dust. These weren't abstract metaphors. They were reflections of her world, where soldiers marched endlessly, where cities burned, where chaos always loomed. Her hymns transformed political turmoil into cosmic drama. Here is a quirky tidbit. Mesopotamian kings often claimed to be chosen by the gods through omens, and priests interpreted those signs sometimes from star charts, sometimes from sheep entrails. Imagine Enheduanna presiding over such divinations. A general anxiously waits for the verdict. Will the gods favor tomorrow's campaign? A priest lays out a sheep liver, pointing to its strange markings. Enheduanna, but knowing, declares that Inanna's storm will sweep away their enemies. The general breathes relief. Soldiers march, and her words ripple outward like commands disguised as prophecy. Historians still argue whether her hymns were intended mainly as religious devotion or as deliberate tools of imperial control. Some see her as the first propagandist, embedding Akkadian authority into the language of worship. Others insist her passion was genuine, that she wrote out of sincere belief and personal experience, with politics as a byproduct. Maybe it was both. Perhaps her survival depended on blurring that line until it no longer mattered. But think of the strain this must have caused. Every word she uttered had consequences beyond the temple. If she praised Inanna too fiercely, rebels might see it as an imperial threat. If she faltered in ritual, the people might interpret it as divine disapproval of Akkad. She was not only a priestess, she was a pressure valve for an entire empire. Her poetry, the bridge between fragile human order and the unpredictable will of gods. Still, storms were not always destructive. Sometimes they were cleansing, just as a desert storm clears the air. Enheduanna's hymns cut through political noise to reveal something universal: the fragility of human power, the endurance of divine order, and the stubborn resilience of one woman's voice. Picture her again, standing atop the ziggurat at night. The wind whips her robe, sand stings her cheeks. The horizon glows faintly with fires from distant battles. Yet above her, the stars remain steady, eternal. She lifts her hands, not trembling this time, but steady. She knows storms pass, empires rise and fall. But her words, pressed into clay, might outlast them all. By the time the storms of empire had rolled past her, Enheduanna's voice had crystallized into something astonishing. She was no longer just an intermediary between gods and men. She was a poet in the truest sense, shaping language itself into a force that outlived battles, kings, and even the empire her father built. Her legacy is not merely that she wrote, it's that she wrote differently. She claimed authorship in a way no one had done before. On some tablets, she explicitly signed her work. The compiler is Enheduanna, that small act, pressing her identity into clay, changed everything. Suddenly, prayer had an author. Suddenly, history had a voice that wasn't lost in anonymity. Peer as a mainstream historical fact. Scholars recognize Enheduanna as the first named author in world history. While earlier texts existed, they floated through time without attribution. Enheduanna stood up in her clay tablets and said, "In essence, I am here. I wrote this. Remember me." And she wasn't modest about it. In the exaltation of Inanna, she declares herself the ornament of the king, the high priestess, and the true woman. She placed herself squarely in the center of divine and political drama. She was not content to vanish behind the gods she praised. She carved herself into their story, but her innovation went beyond signing her name. She injected personality into her hymns. She wrote in first person, describing her emotions: anguish in exile, joy in restoration, awe before the stormy power of Inanna. Her voice trembles and rages, pleads and exhorts. That interiority was groundbreaking. Before her, literature was mostly a record of laws, transactions, or impersonal hymns. After her, writing could become a mirror of the self. Here, as a quirky tidbit, some of her surviving hymns are believed to have been performed with music. Imagine the courtyard of Ur's great temple filled with singers, drums pounding a steady rhythm, lyres plucking melody. A choir chants her words as worshippers sway outside the gates, catching the refrains. Her poetry wasn't just read it, was sung into the air, carried on the wind, woven into the city's daily life. She was the first poet, yes, but also the first to understand literature as performance, as sound and memory combined. Historians still argue whether her role as the first author is overstated. Was she truly the originator, or simply the first whose name was preserved? Some scholars wonder if others, perhaps men of lower status, wrote anonymously long before her. Yet what matters is that she is the one remembered. Her name, pressed into clay, survived where countless others crumbled into dust. Whether by innovation or circumstance, she became the spark that illuminated the concept of authorship itself. Her literary contribution wasn't limited to her own life either. By standardizing the temple hymns and ensuring her works were copied across generations of scribes, she institutionalized the idea of a canon. She created not just poems, but a curriculum. Imagine young scribes centuries later, hunched over their tablets, grumbling as they copied her lines again and again. They might not have loved the exercise, but in their repetition, they carried her voice forward through time. And her style, she could turn Inanna into a storm sweeping across the plain, terrifying and glorious, but also speak as a woman weeping in exile. She wove cosmic imagery with personal confession. She dared to place her own suffering alongside the grandeur of the gods, as if to say human experience mattered too. That blend of myth and memoir, ritual and raw emotion, was something new under the sun. It's no accident that her legacy survived even when the Akkadian Empire collapsed. Sargon's sons struggled, Naram-Sin rose and fell, and eventually Ur itself went through cycles of destruction and renewal. Yet through it all, Enheduanna's words were copied, preserved, studied. She outlasted dynasties. She outlasted ziggurats that crumbled into sand. She even outlasted her own city when its ruins were buried. Her words were stronger than stone. Picture her in her chamber, clay tablet before her, stylus pressing firmly into the surface. She pauses, leans back, breathes in the smoky air of the lamplit room. She knows, she must know that these words are not fleeting, that someday someone beyond her time will hold these fragments and hear her voice. And here we are, thousands of years later, still speaking her name, still hearing her prayers, her doubts, her songs, still marveling that the world's first author was a woman who dared to step out from the shadows of gods and kings to say, "I wrote this. Echoes are strange things. They begin as a voice, a sound that leaves a mouth, then bounce off walls, mountains, or time itself before reaching another ear." Enheduanna's words, pressed into soft clay 4,000 years ago, became echoes that refused to fade. After her death, scribes continued to copy her hymns, generation after generation, in temple schools, edabas, as they were called, young students hunched over tablets, their reed styluses scratching in rhythm, their hands caked with clay dust. The master scribe barked corrections when wedge marks leaned too far or spacing wobbled. Line after line, they carved her poetry into clay, not out of reverence, but as routine. And yet every mark kept her voice alive. The very boredom of schoolwork preserved her. Here is a mainstream historical fact. Copies of Enheduanna's hymns have been found dating to hundreds of years after her lifetime, proving that her work wasn't just remembered but actively taught. This makes her one of the earliest authors whose writings became part of an established literary curriculum. Her words didn't just survive by chance. They were intentionally transmitted. And think of what that means. Empires rose and fell. Akkad collapsed. Ur itself faced ruin, rebuilt, and ruin again. Kings were forgotten, their monuments toppled or eroded. But in quiet classrooms, boys learning to be scribes still etched Enheduanna's lines into fresh tablets. She became part of their muscle memory, their calloused fingers, their weary sighs. Her voice lingered in the scratches of countless students who never met her, yet repeated her words until they became their own. Now, here as a quirky tidbit. Ancient scribal schools sometimes included playful drawings or jokes scrawled on practice tablets, like doodles in the margins of today's notebooks. Imagine a weary student carving Enheduanna's hymn to Inanna, then quickly sketching a crude sheep or writing a silly phrase beside it. Even so, her work endured. her solemn words surviving next to scribbles of ancient graffiti. Historians still argue how widespread her influence really was. Was she copied everywhere across Mesopotamia, or mainly in Sumerian strongholds like Ur and Nippur? Did ordinary worshippers know her name, or only the scribal elite? The tablets don't answer definitively. But the fact that her poetry resurfaced centuries later shows her reach was not limited to her lifetime. She wasn't just a local priestess of Nana anymore. She had become literature. Picture the journey of her words. A tablet copied in Ur, carried by caravan to Nippur, buried in archives there. Another made in Akkad, stored in a temple library. Another recopied centuries later in Babylon, still bearing her name. Clay doesn't rot like papyrus or parchment. Baked hard, those tablets waited patiently under sand and rubble. While empires fell, languages changed, and centuries stacked up like sediment. And then, millennia later, archaeologists brushed away the dust. In the 20th century, fragments of her works were pieced together from excavation sites in Iraq. Scholars stared in astonishment at the wedge-shaped marks, realizing they were reading the voice of a woman who had lived 43 centuries earlier. A woman who signed her name. A woman who had written herself into time. The echo had traveled far through clay and sand, through conquest and collapse, through forgetfulness and rediscovery. But it reached us, and when you read her hymns today, you don't just see a dead language, you hear her, a priestess exiled and restored, a poet praising a goddess of storms, a daughter of empire, carving her own place in eternity. It's humbling, isn't it? Most voices vanish in a generation, 2 if lucky, but hers survived across the entire arc of civilization. That is the strange power of clay and of courage, the willingness to say, "This is me, I was here, these are my words." So when you hear her echo now, remember, it began as a whisper on a temple roof in your under the same stars you see tonight. For all the power and beauty in Enheduanna's words, there lingers a haze of uncertainty. The further we step back from her world, the more questions gather. We know her name, we have fragments of her hymns, but beyond that much is mystery. Historians still argue whether she truly authored every poem attributed to her. Some claim her voice is too distinct to be anyone else's. The first-person cries of exiles, the bold invocations of Inanna, the rare self-assertion that stamps her presence into clay. Others counter that scribes may have composed under her name, treating Enheduanna less as a person and more as a symbol of priestly authority. Was she an author in the modern sense, or was she a curator, compiling and refining traditions? The debate continues, with tablets offering no definitive answer. Here is a mainstream historical fact. The hymn cycle, known as the Temple Hymns, is considered the oldest known literary corpus attributed to a single figure. Yet the earliest copies we have are from centuries after her death. This temporal gap fuels doubt. Did her originals survive long enough to influence these later scribes? Or did those scribes reconstruct them, attaching her name as an honorific? We don't know for sure. And here's a quirky tidbit. One fragment found by archaeologists seems to repeat lines awkwardly, almost like a student's mistake while copying. That little blunder suggests her texts were school material, but also highlights how fragile the chain of transmission was. A sleepy scribe could garble her words, yet still carry her name forward. The debates don't stop at authorship. Scholars puzzle over her exact political role. Was she genuinely influential in court and empire, or mainly ceremonial, a figurehead whose writings have been romanticized after the fact? Some suggest she was crucial, shaping ideology that bound Akkad's empire together. Others argue her importance was inflated by modern interpreters eager to find a first author who happened to be a woman. Even her exile remains cloudy. Her own hymns describe humiliation and banishment. Yet archaeological silence makes it hard to confirm. Did she wander the wilderness, stripped of power, or was her exile more symbolic, a spiritual lament transformed into metaphor? The ambiguity hangs in the air, but maybe that's part of her endurance. Mysteries draw us closer. If everything were neatly documented, she would be just another priestess, another official of a vanished empire. Instead, she hovers between certainty and legend, a voice we know, but a life we cannot fully pin down. What's undeniable is the weight her words carried. The poetic eye that slips into hymns is too sharp, too personal, to dismiss as formula. When she writes of being cast aside, the pain feels lived. When she praises Inanna's storms, the awe feels immediate. Whether she penned every line or directed others, the emotional truth rings out. Picture it. A woman in 2300 BCE, carving her anguish, her pride, her faith into clay. A chorus of future scribes, copying those words, arguing over their meaning. And now us, thousands of years later, still debating whether the voice we hear is entirely hers. Maybe that is her final triumph. Not certainty, but survival. Not clarity, but echo. She left behind enough to spark arguments across millennia, but never enough to silence mystery. In that balance, half history, half legend share became something larger than life. Her name may be carved in wedge marks on fragile tablets, but her true monument is the ongoing conversation about who she was and what she dared to do. And perhaps that is better than any certainty. The end of Enheduanna's life is wrapped in the same soft veil of uncertainty that covers its beginning. We don't know the exact year she died, or even her age. Was she still young, her life cut short by the relentless duties of priesthood? Or did she live into her later years, a dignified elder watching the empire shift and tremble around her? History is silent on the specifics, but that silence is where imagination allows us to lean closer. Picture her in her final years, walking more slowly through the courtyards of Earth's temple. The great ziggurat, which had once loomed over her like a terrifying mountain of duty, might now have seemed familiar, even comforting. Its massive stairs no longer demanded awe, so much as acknowledgement, like an old friend she had climbed thousands of times. Priests and priestesses who once looked at her with suspicion now bowed with respect. Younger scribes copied her words while she was still alive, their clay tablets cooling in ovens, while she herself sat nearby, perhaps correcting a line, perhaps simply watching. Her authority, by then, had outlasted rebellion, outlasted her own exile, and even outlasted some of the kings in her family line. Dynasties rose and crumbled quickly in Mesopotamia, but she, the high priestess, endured. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The Akkadian Empire began to weaken not long after Sargon's death, and while his grandson Naram-Sin rebuilt it into one of its strongest phases, even he would eventually face devastating rebellions. Enheduanna's later years were thus lived during times of renewed turmoil. She must have felt, once again, the empire shudder beneath her. And yet, within the temple, her poetry and her rituals created continuity. 10 pyres fell, but the gods, the hymns, and the rituals went on. At night, perhaps she still went to the temple roof to gaze at the moon. Imagine her older now, her hair threaded with grey, the desert wind colder against her skin. She looks up at Nana, her patron, and Inanna, her fierce goddess, and wonders if they are proud. She thinks of the long nights she spent pressing stylus to clay, the tears she spilled in exile, the triumph of being restored. Maybe she even smiled, faintly amused, realizing she had carved herself into eternity with nothing more than words. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some Mesopotamian traditions, priestesses were given burial rites that involved placing their remains in or near the temple precinct itself. Scholars debate whether Enheduanna might have been buried at Ur, her bones mingling with the sacred earth she once ruled. If so, her body may have lain beneath the ziggurat's shadow, even as her words flew outward into history. Historians still argue whether her hymns continued to be recited in ritual long after her death, or whether they slowly became primarily teaching texts. Either way, her name survived in copies made centuries later. It is possible that when she died, her immediate influence waned, overshadowed by shifting dynasties and new priestesses. But clay tablets are stubborn things. While empires forgot her, the clay remembered. Her final light over Ur, then, was not a sudden extinguishing, but a slow fading. She left behind no monuments carved in stone, no vast armies, no palaces with her image. She left words, words pressed into clay, words entrusted to scribes, words handed down until their echo reached us today. So what do we imagine her last days looked like? Perhaps she sat surrounded by attendants, the temple still humming with activity, while she grew quieter, her hands too weak to hold a stylus anymore. Maybe she dictated her final thoughts to a scribe, closing with the simple affirmation that she, Enheduanna, had lived, had suffered, had created. Or maybe she spoke nothing at all, letting her earlier words stand as her final testament. Either way, when she died, the city of Ur did not fall silent. The ziggurat still blazed with offerings, the moon still shone, priests still sang, but something was missing. The voice that had united empire, goddess, and personal longing into a single trembling chord. Her physical presence was gone, but her voice strangely, impossibly remained. And perhaps that is the most human truth of all. In the end, what survives us are not crowns, not armies, but words. And Enheduanna, 4,000 years ago, knew that better than most. Now, as we leave Enheduanna's world, let the noise of empires fade into the distance. The clamor of markets, the chanting of priests, the echo of drums and lyres, let them grow softer, until they are no louder than the rustle of reeds along a canal at night. Picture her ziggurat standing against the sky, its steps pale in moonlight, and let the image slowly dissolve, like mist slipping away with dawn. Your breathing steadies, slow and even, like the flow of the Euphrates drifting past the city's walls. With each inhale, imagine the cool desert air. With each exhale, release the weight of dynasties and forgotten rebellions. The world grows still. Enheduanna's voice, once fierce and trembling, becomes a whisper carried across time. Her words no longer shout of exile or triumph. They drift softly now, like lullabies. You don't need to remember every detail of her hymns or the names of temples. All that matters is the rhythm, the reassurance that someone long ago found peace in words, and you can too. The stars she once stared at still shine. They are the same stars above you tonight. Imagine lying beneath them, a warm breeze brushing over you, the hum of insects rising in the dark. The moon glows, silver and patient, watching as you let go of the day's weight. Let yourself sink, slowly, gently, into quiet. The courtyards are empty, the lamps are out, and the temple gates are closed for the night. Nothing more is demanded of you. Nothing more is needed. Only rest and the calm certainty that words, like dreams, can carry you across ages and safely into sleep.